In this video, I want to go over a question that every woodworker encounters at some time. What order do I buy the big six in? The big six being table saw, planer, router, bandsaw, joiner, and miter saw. These are generally your most expensive and in many cases your largest footprint purchases. As we go along, we often hit a point where we've got some money saved up and we want to know what next. If you don't want to watch the rest of this is the order from me, if I could go back, that I would buy them in. Table saw, planer, router, bandsaw, joiner, miter saw. Now that's a controversial take, especially with the miter saw here. But if you're interested to know why, keep watching this video. Now the order in this video that I provide is again what I would purchase going back in time. However, there is no hard set rule written on stone. One of the things you need to do is think, what are the next 3 projects I'm going to be doing? That will help you determine how much use you're going to get out of something over the next few months, next few weeks, whatever it is. Let's say you're making a chair, a deck, and then a box. Well, the jointer, helpful for the chair and the box, but not particularly needed for the deck. A miter saw may be more important for the deck because you're going to be chopping a ton of wood to length. So try to sit down, write out a few projects that you want to do, and then consider which is the next tool that you should purchase. The last thing I want to say is do not put yourself in debt buying really fun power tools. They are fun, they are cool, and boy can they get expensive very quickly. Take your time and save up money to buy the best tool you can. I fully believe in being patient and buying better quality when I can afford it than getting the tool right away. If you look at your next 3 projects and think, well, I need a jointer, but I can't afford a jointer, consider choosing different projects. Do not put yourself in debt, please. If you are buying any of these power tools, dust collection, dust protection, and particle collection should be something you get immediately. You will be stunned at how much dust some of these power tools create. The planer alone can fill an entire room full of dust like that. A good dust mask is absolutely necessary as well. A lot of these tools produce very fine particles, and some of them can throw things back up at you. So these should all be purchased with your beginning purchases of a big tool to give you the safety you need to use those tools effectively. I personally just use a basic rigid vacuum for all of my tools. It's not the best. I'd say I get about 75-80% dust collection on most tools, but it's what I have space for and what I can afford at this time. I believe this was about $100 and you can find them at most home centers. Dust mask is a basic GVS dust mask. I wear glasses and headphones and this fits really well. I also wear these safety glasses over and it also fits well. These are just a cheap Amazon box of safety glasses and I found that they've protected my eyes incredibly well. You can spend a lot more money on these things, but I think there is a certain level at which you get diminishing returns. And I think this is a good starting point for any woodworker. A good dust mask with replaceable filters. I do not like the RZ mask that a lot of people wear. I think it fits very poorly. And you can spend a lot on safety glasses, but I think some of the basic ones from Amazon or Home Center are perfectly fine. Now the first tool on my list is the table saw. This is a job site saw, this is a cabinet saw. Most of you will be starting out with something like a job site saw. The reason the table saw is first on my list is because it allows us to do 3 critical things. It allows us to cut a board to width by doing a rip cut, to cut it to length by doing a cross cut, and if we want, we can run it through on its side to resaw into a different thickness. That's a little more complicated, but it's something that can easily be done, and I'll do if my piece is too big for my bandsaw. Now, the table saw in a job site saw size package is wonderful because it allows you to easily fold it up and store it. Most job site saws can be folded, or you can buy a separate folding base to go with it. Generally, modern job site saws have a decent amount of power and can do most woodworking projects that a beginner can do. This DeWalt is one of the higher end job site saws. I believe it's about $600 and I used this for 3 years and I absolutely loved it. Sure, I got my cabinet saw for a reason, but I would recommend this to anyone as a first purchase if you are able to spend that kind of money. If not, there are lower tier job site saws which are very good. Rigid makes a relatively good one. There are lots of them out there. You can also spend a lot more. Something like a SawStop job site saw. I don't think that's necessary in terms of being able to just do the performance. However, Could save your fingers if need be. So consider your first purchase and really look heavily at the table saw because of its ability to rip, crosscut, and resaw. The other reason I think a table saw should be first on your list is that it allows you to make an unbelievable amount of jigs. Special purpose jigs allow you to do something that otherwise you would not be able to do with the table saw. This is a jointing jig. When I get lumber, it's generally rough on the edge. This is not straight, it's still got the sawmill marks on there. I need to be able to make this straight, clean, and flat. I cannot just run it up against my fence because it will go all over the place. With something like a jointing jig, I can clamp this down, run this side against the fence, and have a nice, clean, straight edge. Jigs like box joint jigs can be easily made, finger joint jigs. I have a video on that to use with the table saw. And I had all of these for this job site saw before I modified and changed them to fit my cabinet saw. So you absolutely can do box joints, jointing jigs, everything on this saw. Do not worry and think that you have to have a cabinet saw. One last comment I want to make on the table saw is that on places like Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, there are a lot of really good older used saws out there. Now generally they're not job site saws, they're more contractor size, and they're a little wider, they're generally much heavier, made more of metal, usually with a cast iron top of some type. If you have the space for a contractor saw that's older and well made, it's a very good idea. It's something you should definitely consider when you're looking to purchase the saw. There are a lot of great builds from the 70s, 80s, and 90s out there that are still running fine and you can get for a really good deal on a Craigslist or a Facebook Marketplace. So put that on your list to consider when you're thinking about your first table saw. Now, number 2 on my list is the planer. This is a tool that I didn't get until much later in my journey, probably 2.5, 3 years in. I think I've had it for a year or less. And the minute I got it and the minute I started using it, I realized how much of a mistake it was to wait so long. It doesn't seem like the most obvious choice to get early on, and I think most people would probably say you shouldn't. But in my opinion, the planer does something that no other tool other than a jointer can do, but also has many other features. It can face joint a board, meaning it can get the board flat. In woodworking, there are 3 things that are super important to every project and how our project is going to turn out. It's getting wood flat, straight, and square. Now the table saw will deal with the straight and square through jigs, miter gauges, stuff like that to edge joint. But to even get the best results for straight and square, you need flat. You need the face of this board to be flat. You can see the suction that happens when you get a nice flat board, and the planer can help us do that by using a planer sled. There are many videos out there on great different methods. I simply use a small wedge system, put the wedges under anywhere there's a tip or a twist or a cup, and then hot glue it down and run it through. And basically this allows us to then use something like 3/4 MDF as a reference surface, and it is flat. It's extremely flat, meaning the top of the board that the planer cuts on will come out flat. I cannot emphasize enough how big of a difference it is to have a flat piece of wood. This is a piece of 6/4 poplar. It's very rough. It's had one edge that I've done a little hand planing on while fine-tuning one of my hand planes, but it's got an edge that's still rough and another face that's still rough. And it's got a twist, a cup, and a bow. It's a total mess. Now, if you try to run this through the table saw and it's moving all over the place, you're not going to get a nice straight edge. Even holding it with the jointing jig, as soon as you then put it on the table saw to rip the other side, it's going to move and you'll have a different angle at the front and the back. It's also cupped, so it's a little dangerous when we put it through the table saw, because if we put it cupped down, it can move left or right, and if we put it cupped up, when the blade cuts through, those 2 sides will then come down. So getting this piece of wood flat is essential to being able to use it for other tasks. A lot of times you'll get pine from Home Depot that's a total mess. It may look nice, but it's got cup, twist, everything in it. Using a planer sled in the planer can get you that flat face. Now, much like a jointer, a flat face doesn't always stay forever. Some wood just has internal tension. But with the planer, you can then take another pass the next day on your planer sled to make sure that right before you work with it, it's nice and flat. Like I said, I can't emphasize enough how much better it is to do woodworking with flat wood. Now this is a very expensive planer. I think it's like $600 or $700 now. I was fortunate enough to buy some of my tools before some giant price hikes. I think I got this for around $500, so I was very happy with that. And this is one of the larger lunchbox planers or benchtop, and you absolutely don't have to go with something this big. I still use straight knives. They work totally well. It's extremely loud. This machine is extremely loud. So if you're somebody who's working in a garage at home, I would just say be prepared ahead of time for a loud planer, and you may want to get the helical head to put inside of whatever planer you get. You can spend $200–300 on a planer and get a relatively good result, but the bigger and the heavier the planer is, the less chatter there's going to be as it goes through. But like I said, the reason I would get this second is because it can get me a flat face, which is so important for every other cut you make after that to have a flat face. You will struggle to get it square if this is moving as you push it through your sled or miter gauge. So even though this is something most people get later on in their journey, and there's probably going to be a lot of people who disagree with this, if I could go back in time, I would get the planer as my second tool. It just makes everything easier, more accurate, and way less of a hassle. I almost forgot to mention what's actually the purpose of the planer, and it's to change the thickness of our wood. Face joining allows us to get it flat. You flip it over and you take the face off of the other side, it will equal the flat side. But in general, this is for changing the thickness of our wood. 3/4 from a hardware store is a really good general size. It looks good, it's got the right proportions for a lot of projects. It's not too thick, it can be run through table saws well, etc., etc. But there's something really fun about being able to play with the thickness of wood for different projects. Sometimes you have a part and you want it a little thinner than 3/4. Sometimes you're making something and you're using, let's say, 3/4 inch oak or maple from the hardware store, and it's really heavy. You don't want to use pine because there's going to be a little wear and tear on it, so you want to use something harder, but all of a sudden you've built your project and it's really heavy. Well, with the planer, you can of course take the thickness down to maybe 11/16, 5/8, something like that, and take a little weight off, a little thickness off. So when considering your second tool to buy, face joining for flatness, I still think is the most important thing about buying this second, and then getting to play with your thicknesses as well. It's a lot of fun. It'll really open a lot of different areas for projects for you. One thing I will just mention about this DeWalt, in case you've been eyeing up something like this thing puts out a ridiculous amount of dust and chips. It has an internal fan, most planers don't, so it ejects them. It will fill up the entire shop you have with dust and chips. So one downside is you have to find a way to vent that out. Mine just goes into a cabinet and then the vacuum hooks into the cabinet. This is relatively, easy to store, but it's about 100 some pounds. It's not easy to lift. It's got a small-ish footprint, but you're probably going to need to either have it permanently affixed to something like a cart that's mobile, or another person that can help you lift it onto the desk every time. Yes, one person can do this, but I'd suggest a back brace and good insurance. So take that into consideration too when you decide on what type of planer to buy when you do make that choice. There are lighter weight ones that are smaller. The traditional lunchbox is narrower. Just wanted to add that in case people have been eyeing up this planer. I love it, by the way. I think this is great. It's a wonderful planer. Now, number 3 on my list is the router, the full-size router. There are a few reasons why I think this is a tool that you should get early on. The first is it allows you to do joinery by machine, box joints, dovetail joints using a dovetail jig, that kind of thing. That can really take the aesthetics of your woodworking up a level. It also allows you to cut mortises and tenons much easier. Using a plunge router to cut a mortise is, I'll be honest, a lot easier than hand chopping that thing. I use way more mortises and tenons because I can use the router. I don't love doing it with my chisels. The next thing that it's really great for is being able to do grooves and dados on pieces of wood that may not be perfectly square that can go through the table saw. Perhaps you've got a part that's got a weird angle on it or whatever, or it's really tiny or really, really big, and you want to put a groove through it or a dado through it. Using the router is a great way to do this if you don't want to run it through the table saw, or don't have a table saw, or don't have a flat bottom blade. Router bits leave a flat bottom, and that will allow you to get a nice dado that looks very clean. The next thing that's really cool about having a router earlier on is the ability to use edge profiles. Router bits that have a shape that is recessed out of them that will then leave the matching opposite shape on the piece of wood. Whether you're rounding over a table, you're putting an OG, I believe that's how you say it, onto a table, onto a box, whatever it is. Box lids can look really cool with some different edge profiles put into them. It's a really fun way to take that aesthetic nature and kind of what looks like fanciness of your project up a notch. People will have no idea how simple it actually was to cut the thing, and they'll think it looks beautiful. Now with the router, I'm not including a router table. Yes, router tables are great and they're very nice to have, but they're expensive, they take up more room, and they're on my list of kind of like secondary tools, which I may do a video about. But almost everything that you can do on a table can be done with the handheld router. You can do those joints, those box joints, dovetail joints with a jig that clamps onto your desk. You don't have to have a router table to do that. So when you're considering this purchase, don't think that you have to have the router table as well. Look at it as just the router. I also suggest, if you can, save up for a full-size router. Little mini handheld routers are great. They do a lot of things really well. The trim router allows you to go around, put light chamfers on, and do very small inlay work. But the versatility of the larger router is, in my opinion, significantly greater than that of a palm router, trim router, whatever you want to call it. If you're interested in this Bosch, I have a review video on my page. I think this is a wonderful router. I'd buy it again. I want to buy a second one to put it in my table. It's a great all-around router. Again, not a cheap piece of equipment here, but something that I think you get so much out of over the years. So many new things are opened up to you once you can get different router bits as well. So consider this, number 3 on my list. Number 4 on my list is the bandsaw, and this can be a benchtop bandsaw like the one I have here. And this could actually go higher on the list depending upon what type of woodworking you want to do. If you have a smaller space and you use a lot of hand tools, the bandsaw can essentially do the same things as the table saw, but it requires some more cleanup. If you've got a bunch of hand planes and you love it, you can get one of these and do all your ripping on the bandsaw, and it will be much quicker, in my opinion, than using a large panel saw or whatever you want to do to rip a long piece of wood. However, the main reasons I use it are for resawing and for cutting out curves and shapes that are a little awkward to do with the jigsaw. It allows you to use various sizes of blades to cut really tight, really interesting shapes out of a piece of wood, especially out of things that are just too small to cut with a jigsaw. And then the ability to resaw in what I think is a slightly safer package on the bandsaw than doing it on the table saw is a huge, huge part of why I love this tool so much. Taking a piece of wood that's relatively thick, you don't need all of it, but you don't want to just plane that stuff down and just create pounds of sawdust. Well, you resaw it, and now you've got a smaller piece of wood that you can use sometime later, and then you just do a pass or two on your planer, and you've got the size you want for your main piece. So while it is number 4 on my list, I do think there is the argument to move it up to possibly even the top of the list if you are a heavy hand tool user, but you want to get some of the harder work done using a power tool. A nice benchtop one like this Rikon doesn't take up a ton of space. You could literally just mount this on your workbench. This can be picked up by one person if you wanted to store it on the floor, but it's heavy and it's awkward. So generally I would suggest mounting it. But overall, again, you get to take your woodworking up a notch by being able to cut out curves and things, which is really fun. And it's also much quieter and arguably much safer than a lot of other cutting tools. As long as you're not dumb and putting your hands right there, there's not going to be anything flying back at you. This doesn't have kickback. It can kick down a bit and something can come kind of popping up, but overall this is one of the safer tools after maybe only the scroll saw. So if you've got maybe a young teenager, you want to do some woodworking with them, a bandsaw is not a bad idea to have in the shop for them to do some stuff on that perhaps they're maybe not ready to do with a table saw or something larger. Number 5 on my list is the jointer. As you can probably tell, I don't have a jointer yet, so I'm going to let you see some nice pieces of lumber I got from the lumber yard the other day while I discuss why it's number 5 on my list. Now the jointer does 2 things. It puts a flat face on one side of a board and it puts a flat, square, straight edge on the other. That's it. It's a very specific purpose tool, but what it does do, it's really good at, and it does it quicker and arguably better than jointing on the planer and edge jointing on the table saw. The reason it's number 5 on the list is because you can do both of those functions with the table saw and the planer. So I don't see it anywhere near a necessity in the same way that certain other tools may be higher on the list. The jointer is a relatively pricey tool, and because it only does 2 functions that can be done relatively well with other tools that have more functions to them, it's a little later on my list. That may be a little controversial. I've seen some people out there doing tool lists that have the jointer pretty high, but without a planer, you can't get the next side equal to the flat face unless you hand plane and are really accurate at it. So I don't really see a point to having a jointer before you get a planer and a table saw. It's on my list. It's going to be the next thing I buy, but we got to do a little saving up for that. So hopefully eventually I'll be able to make a video on whichever one I end up getting. We'll move on to number 6 and the final one on the list. Now the last major tool on the big 6 list is the miter saw. Now as you can tell, this is not a miter saw, and no, I do not have a miter saw anymore. The miter saw was the first tool I bought, if I remember correctly, and I was doing a few large outdoor projects. I didn't have any other skills with woodworking, and I needed to be able to just chop things to length quickly and relatively accurately. Now my miter saw was a 12-inch Ryobi sliding, and the reason I ended up getting rid of it is after those few outdoor projects, I realized I was just rough cutting lumber after I got home. That was essentially all it was being used for. And I ended up, I think, either selling it or taking the motor out of it and tossing the rest and replacing it with this $30-some Japanese pull saw. I use this to cut down all my lumber when I get home to store it, and any other crosscuts I need cutting to length I do on the table saw, or if it's something super long I do it with a square and a circular saw. So there are going to be a lot of people who highly disagree with this and have the miter saw much higher. And depending upon what you're doing, it could be first on your list. If you're cutting a deck and everything's to the right width, but you've got a ton of stuff to cut to length, the miter saw makes way more sense than a Japanese pull saw or a table saw. So this goes back to you determining what your 3 next projects are. Now the one thing a miter saw can do very well, if it's a relatively decent miter saw, is cut a compound angle, meaning an angle this way and an angle this way. So this is a compound miter cut where you have one angle that's a bevel and one that's a traditional miter. Things like trim can be done with the compound angle. Now that's a function you can do on the table saw, absolutely. It takes a little more setup time and you're more limited by the length of board you can do. The nice thing about a miter saw is you can have a miter saw station or some rollers on either side and cut a super long piece of wood. However, you can do that as well with the circular saw. One thing I'll say about miter saws is that the cheaper you are, the less accurate they are, and it kind of scales up pretty quickly. So with the Ryobi 12-inch sliding, that thing was a total mess. No matter how many times I reset it up and tweaked it, there was just too much slop in the pull mechanism and the plunge mechanism. It never got me a cut that I really wanted to be the final cut on kind of the more fine furniture looking projects. I would always come to the table saw afterwards and do the finishing cut there. So you can see I ended up in a situation where I was doing the rough cutting with this and the finishing cuts with my table saw. I had no need for a miter saw. So I know it's going to be very controversial to put last. A lot of people buy it as their first tool, which I did, but in hindsight, I absolutely had no long-term need for it. Could have done the same function for my projects with a circular saw because the accuracy wasn't of high importance. If you are going to get a miter saw and you want to invest in one, I'd consider going with a mid to higher cost miter saw because the lack of slop in the pull and plunge mechanism is so vital if you want it to be used for final cutting to length. If you have any slop side to side, it's not going to be a perfect 90, and if you have any slop going back and forth, left and right, it could be out of bevel. So it's a real problem if you don't have a decent quality one to use for final cuts. There are lots of people on YouTube Woodworking who do final cuts and they have a nicer DeWalt or the Glorious Festool, Capex, or whatever it's called. If you can spend that much money on a miter saw, by all means use it to cut the final length. Or if you're doing outdoor projects and you don't need extreme accuracy, yes, Something like a Ryobi miter saw will get you relatively close, but it's not good enough for fine furniture. That's my list of the order of tools of the big six to buy. Now I will remind you at the end, everything that you can do with a power tool, you can do with a hand tool of some sort. So do not feel like you need these big power tools to do woodworking. There are plenty of people out there who have zero power tools other than maybe a drill, but you can hand drill as well. So don't take this list as a you need this tool or that tool. Take this as a, if you want to get into machine woodworking, power tool woodworking, and you're looking at what order to buy in, consider this list while also thinking about the projects you want to do. Thanks for watching, and if you want to go in the comments and vehemently disagree with me, go for it. Anything will help anybody else reading along. It's always good to have a bunch of different opinions. Have a good night or day or wherever you are. Thank you.